Observation of nature finds the notion realized in inorganic nature, laws whose moments are things which at the same time have the character of abstractions. But this notion is not a simplicity that is reflected into itself. The life of organic nature, on the other hand, is only this intro-reflected simplicity. The antithesis within it of universal and individual does not sunder itself in the essence of this life itself. The essence is not the genus which in its undifferentiated element would be self-sundered and self-moved, and at the same time would be for itself undifferentiated in its antithesis. Observation finds this free notion, whose universality contains just as absolutely within it developed individuality, only in the notion which itself exists as notion, that is, in self-consciousness. In paragraph 298, we're now entering a new portion of Hegel's Phenomenology. It's not a very long portion, but there's an important transition that's taking place here. And the next sub-portion that's going to be following is closely connected with it, and you might say using it as a springboard. The section that includes the famous physiognomy and phrenology, which Hegel, by the way, is not endorsing. He's actually attacking those pseudosciences in his discussion. So here we notice that we move from observation of nature through, in the previous section, observation of organic nature, and now we're talking about observation of self-consciousness. And we want to see why that transition is taking place, and it really is beginning in this paragraph. We're going to talk about that in a moment. I do want to signal the difference between this section and the section that follows. So this is observation of self-consciousness in its purity and in its relation to external actuality. You don't get, in a Hegelian perspective, you don't get things fully detached, totally separated from the environing world and the observing or engaging, interacting consciousness that is working with them. That would be a very abstract way of looking at things, and Hegel is trying to move away from the abstract, not because the abstract is necessarily false in and of itself, but because when placed in contraposition to actual living things or human culture or whatever it is that we're trying to observe, the abstract makes itself false by pretending to be what the thing really is. So this section is, like I said, self-consciousness in its purity. That's why Hegel's going to begin talking about logical and psychological laws and whether they apply or can hold or really are laws at all. The next section, the one that includes the physiognomy and phrenology, is observation of the relation of self-consciousness to its immediate actuality. And what is the difference there? Well, as we're going to see, the individual and the universal are going to be playing off against each other throughout this section. In this section, we're looking for what really is universal, what we can say about all human minds. Now, if you think about modern philosophy, the way that typically took place was not by, even among the empiricists, doing a kind of, inductive generalization by looking at many, many people. That didn't happen at first. If you look at, say Locke or Hume or people like that, they make just as much reference to reflection, to looking at one's own experience and using that as sort of the model, as do the so-called continental rationalists like Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, Leibniz, all these people. And these are leading up to Hegel's position. A bit after that, we're going to see a lot of attempts to empirically say something, an inquiry that's being carried out inductively about the totality of human beings, or in general, not just human beings in the world, but human beings in a specific place, like say Germany or England. But that's a lot of preface. So let's talk about what's happening in this paragraph. So Hegel begins by saying observation of nature finds the notion realized in inorganic nature. That sounds kind of strange, doesn't it? Finds the notion realized. Well, what he means there is it's been trying to understand the notion by way of inorganic nature, in which we have a universal and an individual who are connected with each other, and we can say that, whatever salt we want to look at, or, whatever other chemical compound we want to look at, we can make sense of it. The universal just is sort of the type, and the individual just is sort of the instance, right? And the universal is abstract, and the individual is just something perceived. There's no life to it. We don't expect life in inorganic nature. But this means that it's something that is merely an object for consciousness. It does have an in itself, but that in itself doesn't have the same sort of value as it does for the smallest living thing. So he goes on and he says, these moments have the character of abstractions, but this notion is not a simplicity that is reflected into itself. Where do we have to go for that? Well, that is when we're talking about organic nature. The organic nature is something that has a telos, and its telos is in part to maintain itself in existence. It has a kind of fluidity, as we've talked about. It possesses a certain degree of freedom. That's going to be a very important concept in this entire section. So he goes on and he says, the life of organic nature is only this intro-reflected simplicity. It's the inner of which we've been trying to find the outer, in all these permutations in the past section. He goes on and he says, the antithesis within it of individual and universal does not sunder itself in the essence of life itself. There is an antithesis, there is an opposition, a dynamic relation between the universal and the individual within the organic being. Now the question is, well, where are we going to find this? And Hegel says, well, do we get this in terms of the genus? We talked quite a bit about that in the last section. It says the essence is not the genus, which in its undifferentiated element would be self-centered and self-moved, and at the same time would be for itself undifferentiated in its antithesis. Where do we look instead? Observation finds this free notion, free concept, free Begriff, whose universality contains just as absolutely within it developed individuality. Developed individuality, that's a key thing there. We're no longer talking just about organisms. We're talking about human beings. Remember how towards the end of the last section, Hegel started talking about world history and spirit and all of that, and said that life by itself, just pure living things, don't have a history. Human beings do. Now we're getting to the distinctively human. So he says, observation finds this free notion only in the notion which itself exists as notion. There's a little misprint there, at, it says in Miller's translation, but it should be as. This is self-consciousness, grasping oneself as an individual and yet also as a universal, and vice versa. It is a universal trait of human being to not only be individual, but also to be universal. So what does all that mean? Well, we're going to see this played out now in the paragraphs yet to come. When observation now turns in upon itself and directs its attention to the notion existing as free notion, it finds to begin with the laws of thought. This individuality which thought is in its own self is the abstract movement of the negative, a movement wholly retracted into simplicity. And the laws are outside of reality. To say that they have no reality means in general nothing else than that they lack truth. They are indeed not supposed to be the entire truth, but still formal truth. But what is purely formal without any reality is a mere figment of thought, or pure abstraction, without that internal division, which would be nothing else but the content. On the other hand, however, since they are laws of pure thought, and pure thought is intrinsically universal, and therefore a knowledge which immediately contains being, and therein all reality, these laws are absolute notions, and are inseparably the essential principles both of form and of things. Since immanent self-moving universality is the sundered simple notion, the latter thus has in itself a content, and one which is all content, only not a sensuous being. It is a content which is neither in contradiction with the form, nor is separated from it. Rather, it is essentially the form itself. For the latter is nothing else but the universal dividing itself into its pure moments. What we see in paragraph 299 is Hegel introducing and grappling with one of the first dualities, not dualisms, but dualities that is running throughout this entire section of observation of self-consciousness, that, in this case, between thought and reality, or being, and how the formal and the content are connected as well in that duality. So we've really got two dualities here that are paired off with each other. Hegel begins by talking about observation of notion as free notion. What do we mean there? So observation of the concept. And what was the concept? Well, originally it was inorganic nature, then it was organic nature, and then it was what? Free self-consciousness, the human being, the notion per se, embodied in human beings, no longer just in beetles or amoeba or whatever else we have, but something that can really have a history, that can have culture, that can have development. And he says this leads us to what he's calling here the laws of thought. Now, at this point, I think for a modern audience, that is automatically going to bring up, the ideas of logic, and because, we've got this definition floating out there of logic as the discipline that studies the laws of thought. But what Hegel is talking about is not just logic, and by that he doesn't just mean formal logic anyway, what we teach in contemporary academia as logic, but also psychology. The laws of thought are supposed to not just tell us how we ought to think, but help us understand how human beings do in fact think, and what the necessities involved in that, however complex those necessities may be to articulate, would be. So the question then is, how are thought and reality connected together in these laws? Hegel, like I said, is going to take a double perspective in this paragraph. He starts out by talking about a kind of failure. Thought, he says, here we go, the individuality which thought is in its own self is the abstract movement of the negative, a movement wholly retracted into simplicity, and the laws are outside of reality. So when we think about thought, we have this word that we use, and we use it as a kind of universal, but where does thought really take place? It is individual. This is something that we haven't thought much or haven't thought enough about, the nature of thought, its slippery condition. And so we're going to play around with this a lot in paragraphs yet to come. We don't have to unpack all of this right now. But insofar as it's being considered as individual, it remains abstract. And the laws of thought, which are the formal aspect, are not penetrating to the reality that they're supposed to be grappling with. Hegel goes on and talks about this. The laws are outside of reality. And he says to say that they have no reality means in general that they lack truth. So in this failure to get any further towards reality, there is a gap, there is a lack, there is something missing there. And, as we know, in the Hegelian universe, wherever there's some negative, there's always going to be something coming in to fill it in with what? With content. So now we look at the relationship between form and content, which is going to play a major role in future paragraphs. He says, they are indeed not supposed to be the entire truth, but still formal truth. When we talk, and this is where, think about what we do in a logic class. People often get quite upset when they find out that what they learn in a logic class doesn't immediately translate to the reality of social existence and the real life arguments that we make towards each other and in relation to each other, and in a context, they say, oh, this is no good. And then the logician comes along and says, hey, I wasn't trying to provide you with that. I was merely trying to provide you with sort of the formal conditions for reasoning or inference or something like that. And so Hegel says, yeah, this is one way in which we do, in fact, understand this. So the laws are just supposed to be formal, and that's supposed to be formal truth. Now that's a problem. Hegel says, whatever is purely formal without any reality is a mere figment of thought. It becomes subjective in the bad sense of subjectivity, right? He says it's a pure abstraction without that internal division, which would be nothing else but the content. If there isn't a dialectical relationship between the form and the content, between the inhalt, right, and the structure, the orientation, then we're losing out something, and we're just playing with abstractions or figments of our own imagination. This would be indeed what Hegel, at many points in other works, calls a philosophy of the understanding as opposed to a philosophy of the concept. Now, on the other hand, as he goes on and tells us, he says, since they are laws of pure thought, and pure thought is intrinsically universal, so if we're no longer just dealing with the individual, but we're thinking in terms of the universal, then that means that thought actually does encompass all reality. This is the idealism, right? That reason, observing reason, and reason itself is bringing to the world. Hegel says that it contains all being, and they're in all reality. So what does that mean? These laws are absolute notions and are inseparably the essential principles both of form and of things. So both of the form and of the content. So if that's the case, then these are sort of bound together and no longer simply opposed. The form receives it, internal division within it. The laws extend into the content. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? So he goes on and he says, since immanent self-moving universality is a sundered, simple notion, the latter thus has in itself a content, but not just any content. Hegel says this is the content that has all content. So what we're doing when we're trying to understand these laws of thought, we're not just trying to understand, well, how do human beings think? We're trying to understand how do human beings interact with reality. Otherwise it would be purely formal, right, and wouldn't help us out in relation to reality. So we have to encompass all reality to do that, which means that the content has to be everything. The totality of the system, you could say, right? So he says, is all content not only a sensuous being, it's a content which is neither in contradiction with the form, nor is separated from it. Rather, it is essentially the form itself. For the latter is nothing else but the universal dividing itself into its pure moments. How do we indeed grasp content? We grasp content through form. We don't grasp it as totally divorced from form. Now, we may do that when we're doing exercises like mind mapping and trying to figure out where do things fit in with each other. We're going to brainstorm and then try to, arrange them into charts. But that's a very, very artificial sort of process from a Hegelian perspective. When we're really looking at not only the world, but introspectively our own minds, the form itself is self-dividing. The content itself is already connected with form. But the way in which this form or content presents itself to observation qua observation gives it the character of something found, something that is given, that is, a content that merely is. It becomes a quiescent being of relations, a multitude of detached necessities which, as in and for themselves a fixed content, are supposed to have truth in their determinateness, and thus are, in fact, withdrawn from the form. This absolute truth of fixed determinatenesses, or a number of different laws, contradicts, however, the unity of self-consciousness, or of thought and form in general. What is asserted to be a fixed law that is in itself constant can only be a moment of the unity which is reflected into itself, can only appear as a vanishing magnitude. But, torn out of this context of movement in the course of considering them and represented separately, it is not content that they lack, for they possess a definite content, but rather form which is their essence. In point of fact, these laws are not the truth of thought, not because they are supposed to be merely formal and to possess no content, but rather for the opposite reason. That is, that they are supposed in their determinateness, or just as a content from which form has been removed, to rank as something absolute. In their truth as vanishing moments, in the unity of thought, they would have to be taken as a knowing or as a movement of thought, but not as laws of being. But observing is not knowing itself and is ignorant of it. It converts its own nature into the form of being. That is, it grasps its negativity only as laws of knowing. It is sufficient here to have pointed out the invalidity of the so-called laws of thought from the general nature of the case. The more precise development belongs to speculative philosophy, in which they show themselves to be what they are in truth, that is, single vanishing moments whose truth is only the whole movement of thought, that is, knowing itself. Here in paragraph 300, Hegel is telling us something that, if you really think out its implications at this point, it is quite extraordinary. He is grappling still with this notion of laws of thought, or this idea of laws of thought that we would somehow derive from observation of self-consciousness, by self-consciousness, now at this point, of course, taken up into the higher gestalt of reason, which attempts to find laws for things, no longer just to live and find its meaning in the world the way the previous shapes of self-consciousness did in that section. And what he says is that observation is trying to grasp this relationship between form and content, but it's finding it as something merely given, something that is found, a content that merely is, given by what? Given by reality. Reality here is the other that is being attempted to be grasped by the observing consciousness, which is also an other to itself, as we found in the self-consciousness section. There's a lot of stuff going on behind the scene in this section if we draw it out. So what does Hegel have to tell us about this relationship between form and content that it's trying to get to? He says, because it finds it merely as something given, it finds it as a content that merely is, it becomes a quiescent being of relations, a restful being of relations. It's lost its dynamicity, we could say, right? It is a multitude of detached necessities. That goes a little bit further. So relations, things are still connected. Detached necessities means that these things are supposed to have some sort of necessity in and of themselves that can be totally separated, totally abstracted from all the other necessities within the system, within the world, within consciousness, within the field of thought. That's going to present a major problem in just a moment. But let's go on. So he says, he finds a multitude of detached necessities, and he says that these in and for themselves are fixed contents. In the previous paragraph we were talking about form. Now we're saying that they have fixed contents. And what do we mean by this? Well, think about when people try to articulate, and we'll stick just with the laws of thought in this case, when they're teaching you something out of a textbook about psychology or about economics or about really anything having to do with the human. Marketing is a great example of this as well. Self-help books in certain ways. I'm going to teach you the 8 principles of how people act. Well, what you're doing there is you're teaching content, and you're teaching it as sort of detached from the other contents. What mediates, what connects contents with each other? Do they smush into each other and bleed into each other? No, there has to be form. There has to be structure there. And for Hegel, that structure cannot itself simply be just yet another content, something inert. It's going to have to be something dynamic That's what's been left out in so many accounts. So what are we after in this? We're trying to attain to the law, the overarching law for self-consciousness. But what he says is this absolute truth of fixed determinatenesses yields us laws in the plural, right? He says a number of different laws, which unfortunately, though, contradicts the unity of self-consciousness. We want there to be a law, a way of understanding things, a dynamic intelligibility to all of this. But instead what we're getting are a whole bunch of laws, and we already know where that's going, right? Because we've been through the force and the understanding section, where if there's a multiplicity of laws, then we want to say, well, how are these actually connected with each other? Insofar as they deal with content, they start to seem less and less like actual laws. When the laws themselves become content, they lose the sense of movement. They're no longer dynamic. They're no longer expressions of freedom, the free notion that we talked about. That's a problem. You might say, if we want to use this language of object, that the more that we objectify the laws about human beings, the less they actually apply to real living human beings, including the ones that are making the laws, which is an interesting issue which he's going to talk about further in paragraphs yet to come. So he goes on and he says, what is asserted to be a fixed law that is in itself constant can only be a moment of the unity which is reflected into itself, can only appear as a vanishing magnitude. What is all that Hegel talks about vanishing magnitudes an awful lot, right? What does he mean by that? What he's saying is that if we've got a plurality of laws, they can really only make sense out of what it is that they're attempting to articulate, attempting to formulate an intelligibility for the thinking subject, if they somehow connect up with each other, if no one single one of them is the, capital T, law, but rather they are relativized, you might say, in relation to each other and in relation to the thinking human being. So Hegel says, torn out of this context of movement in the course of considering these laws represented separately, it's not actually content that they lack. Really, they've got too much content because all they have is content. What's happened, on the other hand, is they have lost the form. Why have they lost form? It doesn't mean they have no articulation, no structure, you don't have any bullet points, you don't have any paragraph A, paragraph B, or anything like that. No, what he means there is they've lost any sort of dynamic movement that would make them something that has to do with self-consciousness and comes from self-consciousness. They are a product which no longer exemplifies the process, you might say. So he goes on and he says, in point of fact, these laws are not the truth of thought. Oh, there's a problem there, right? We want them to be the truth of thought. Not because they're supposed to be merely formal and possess no content, like what was said in the last paragraph, but for the exact opposite reason. He says that they are supposed in their determinateness, or just as a content from which form has been removed, to rank as something absolute. Now, can consciousness accept that? That means consciousness not only begins with something that is given, something that's not only, you might say, heterogeneous to it, but heteronymous, if we want to use a Kantian formulation. If we're talking about free self-consciousness in giving itself laws has to be able to work with those laws to make sense of things. It cannot accept the law simply as something coming from above or from below or from that stuff over there or perhaps even from another self-consciousness. This is a dynamic that we're still going to have to explore. So this plurality of laws is very problematic. This fact that they are just content that is being treated as absolute, very problematic. And he goes on and he says, in their truth, as vanishing moments in the unity of thought, they would have to be taken as a knowing or a movement of thought, but not as laws of being. Then he says something really interesting here. Observing is not knowing itself and is ignorant of it. Self-observation is not yet self-knowledge in this case. More has to be developed. Observation is attempting to make sense out of all of this, and it's going to produce what are going to be postulated as laws of being or laws of knowing that don't actually turn out to be such. He says, it converts its own nature into the form of being. It treats itself as an object, in effect, consciousness. It grasps its negativity only as laws of knowing. Or put it another way, it does epistemology and write books of epistemology as the prologue to doing philosophy. Not only the way that Kant did, but also the way that Hume did, the way that Descartes did, the way that Locke did, the way that even Hobbes did. Hegel is reacting against something prototypically modern here, isn't he? This is quite an interesting development. You have to read into this to see that going on. So he goes on and he says, it's sufficient here to have pointed out the invalidity of the so-called laws of thought from the general nature of the case. The more precise development belongs to speculative philosophy. Who's speculative philosophy? Hegelian speculative philosophy, in which they show themselves to be what they are in truth, single vanishing moments whose truth is only the whole moment of thought, knowing itself. Where are we going to find this in the phenomenology? What point is he going to discuss this? Well, the answer is throughout the entire phenomenology. That's what is going on in this development of, consciousness from these smaller, lower, less complex, less articulate, less self-referential stages to more and more complex stages that can take into account the totality more and more as we go on. This negative unity of thought is for itself, or rather it is being for its own self, the principle of individuality. And in its activity is active consciousness. Consequently, the observing consciousness will, by the nature of the case, be led towards this as the actuality of those laws. Since this connection is not explicit for the observing consciousness, it supposes that thought in its laws remains over on one side, and that on the other side it obtains another being in what is now an object for it. That is the active consciousness, which is for itself in such a way that it supersedes otherness, and in this intuition of itself as the negative, has its actuality. In this short paragraph, number 301, Hegel is setting up a duality that he's going to exploit really throughout the rest of this section in the paragraphs yet to come. So he talks about the negative unity of thought being for itself, and then says that it's actually being for its own self, that is, für sich selbst sein. And we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that in a moment. What's really important here is that through this paragraph, as it flows through, he's setting up something that observing consciousness is splitting its field into, you might say. So on the one side, we have thought in its laws, the laws of thought that we've been looking for up until this point. And although he doesn't say this, this is really the side of the universal, as he's been contrasting the universal against the individual here. On the other side, and this is what he talks about much more in this paragraph, we have the active consciousness. We have consciousness no longer merely as observing, but consciousness as realizing its own involvement in this. And in the paragraphs that are yet to come, we're going to see quite a lot of reflective referentiality of consciousness, being aware of its own situation, at least to some degree. So he talks about this in terms of being the actuality of the principle of individuality. Remember that this section is about self-consciousness grasping itself in terms of not only its universality, but also its actuality, its being as something that can be observed, something that can be registered. Here's where Hegel talks about it as being for its own self, für sich selbst sein. No longer being for self, but being for its own self, being selbst, being in a sort of reflexive relation of, when we talk about identity, we don't mean identity as just logical identity as in A is B, but rather it realizes itself as identical with itself. And again, the implications of this are yet to be drawn out. So he says observing consciousness is going to be led towards this as the actuality of the laws. The laws don't stand by themselves. The laws make sense insofar as they are being referred to and also applied to some sort of individuality. So we've got, once again, the universal on one side and the individual on the other side, and the question is where we're going to go from here. So he's laid out this sort of bifurcation, and he says the act of consciousness is for itself in such a way that it supersedes otherness, and in this intuition of itself as the negative has its actuality. What is its otherness? Well, it has otherness within its own self. But another way of thinking of its other is that of thought in general. The individual is opposed in a certain way to the universal or the general. And we're going to see how this plays itself out, as I said, in the paragraphs yet to come.